listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. And let me tell you, people, that PhD in literature came in pretty handy recently when I went back to reread Rachel Cusk's outline. We always begin these talks with the question of why am I reading the book? Why have you read the book? And why are you tuning in to listen? And this one was interesting to me. First of all, this is one of those books that came in that, top 100 books of the 21st century so far that was put out by the New York Times. That literally seems like, I don't know, like months ago. Actually, maybe it was months ago. Anyway, it was part of that list. And when I saw it, I had this like kind of visceral reaction that was like, wow, that book, everybody loves that book. And I did not love that book. And I was haunted by the fact that I couldn't figure out why I did not, in fact, love Rachel Cusk's outline. So this happened to me also with Sally Rooney. And I went back and read Conversations with Friends and Normal People, actually, because I had seen the television show with Paul Mescal, which was so good. So I went back and read those books, and I actually was able to discover with Sally Rooney that there was this real distance between the narrator and the reader, and there was a lot of withholding on the part of the narrator. And both of those were things that didn't particularly sit well with me. It was very satisfying to figure out what my reservations were where Sally Rooney is concerned. And if you're interested, you can go back and listen to that lecture. It's way back in 2023. But in this case, when I went back to outline, it was so fascinating because it is not a book that I love. It's not a book that, maybe I was like dying to get back to every time I put it down. However, it was a book that was so under my skin. I thought so much about this. And I think that's because it is very challenging in some ways. And I could not wait to dig in deeper and do a little analysis so that both I and all of you could understand a little better what it is that Rachel Cusk is up to. And let me tell you, people, she is up to something that is revolutionary and so interesting. So we always provide an agenda for those of you who like an agenda. We're going to do a little bio of Rachel Cusk very quickly. We're then going to dive into the beginning of the text. Those of you who are longtime Foxed Page listeners know that one way you can improve your reading is by really paying attention, first of all, to the title, but then to the opening. And this is, in fact, a challenging book. When the text is not particularly challenging, that first paragraph isn't necessarily as significant. In a book like this, it does, in fact, really give some signposts and some indications of what it is that Rachel is doing. Rachel. Now we're like on a first name basis, what it is that she is doing and what is so revolutionary about the text. So we'll take a look at the opening. We're then going to look at one paragraph toward the end of the book, because in many ways, I think it sort of states, without a lot of equivocation, the purpose behind this book. So that brings me to an important point. I think you're going to have to read the book before you listen to this, or maybe not. In fact, weirdly, there are kind of no spoilers here because it's, very plotless in lots of ways. So in fact, actually, go crazy. Do it either way. Listen and then read, or read and then listen. But we are going to talk about things that happen at the very end of the book. Then we're going to do something a little different. After I had sort of wrestled with outline for a while, which I like to wrestle with a book a bit before I go and do any research and take in a lot of other voices and opinions. But the first thing that I looked at was an interview. It was a podcast between a woman in Norway and Rachel Cusk, and it was so interesting. So we're going to take a look at the ways that that interview, which was fascinating unto itself, explains a lot of what she's doing. And when we look at each aspect that she mentions in the interview, we'll look at a corresponding piece of the prose to really understand what it is she's getting at. Honestly, some of the statements that they're making during the interview are a tiny bit opaque, so even those were fun to dive into. We're then going to look a little more deeply at the close of the book, which is just really fascinating in many ways. Although again, not a lot of spoilers here because there is not, in fact, a lot of plot. So those of you on the YouTube will notice that this is a little bit of a stripped down me, and that is very purposeful. So I'm going to say right at the start that Rachel Cusk's outline, and in fact the entire trilogy, is really invested in this idea of identity. What is identity? How much control do we have over it? Can it change, and how is it shaped? And there's some very, very subtle things that Rachel Cusk is interrogating in terms of how we sense identity for other people and how we are projecting our own identity. And the way that this manifests in the novel is essentially the narrator is not present. I mean, she is present and we get little bits and pieces of her, which is so fascinating and so titillating when you get some sort of little autobiographical detail. It's like winning the lottery or something. But I have chosen here to really strip things down in the sense that I've tried to do my hair in a very no frills kind of basic way. I'm wearing just a very plain gray shirt. And again, all of that is purposeful because Outline is really asking us to look at things like visual indications, language, and the spaces around people in order to gather your own identity and the identity of the other. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, you're kind of one step ahead in terms of identity because maybe you have no idea what I look like. But of course, she makes the point, and this is very salient, you can actually tell a lot about my voice. You might be able to tell that I am a female person. You might also be able to tell certain things about the region that I come from. Northern California. Also, you might be able to tell my level of education. You might be able to tell, the things that I'm passionate and enthusiastic about. So all of those are things that are very revealing about my identity, and that is just in terms of voice. But so those of you who have visual cues can tell even more. Although in this case, again, I've really stripped things down. Okay, we're going to dive in with a little Rachel Cusk biography. She was born in 1967 in Saskatchewan to British parents. And that is information that I actually had to look up on the Wikipedia because, in fact, there's very little information about her in the auto bio on the book. And again, that is very purposeful in many ways. She spent a lot of her childhood in Los Angeles and then moved to England with her parents. And this is very important because in the interview, she talked a lot about language and how what she would really love is an English that is entirely devoid of any indicators of class or region or education or any of the things that voice reveals. And part of me wonders if, in fact, that was because she was a child of British parents living first in Canada and then in Los Angeles, whether or not she had a sense. I don't know how old she was when her parents moved back to England with her, and she has an English accent that is relatively pronounced. I was working really hard in the interview to try to figure out what region, but I'm just like not that good. But it was interesting. There was a lot in there. There was some slowness of speech. There was some certainty. There was some hesitation. A lot of it actually was very revealing in some interesting ways. So my sense is that even as a small child, or maybe especially as a small child, she would have had a sense of her parents, at least, and maybe herself, as speaking differently than the people around her. And I think, having grown up in California, English people are a real novelty. And so you can imagine that even as a child, she got a lot of attention because of her accent, which in the United States was probably a good thing, but depending on where she was from in England, may not have been quite so positive. And she's been relatively prolific. She's written 7 novels, and they've gotten all sorts of prizes. And she's written 3 memoirs. And in the interview, they asked her if she needed to have written those 3 memoirs that are very personal in order to have written this trilogy, which is in fact fairly autobiographical. And she actually said no. I mean, you have this sense that, from what she was saying in the interview, that the memoirs that she wrote were incredibly revealing and actually caused a huge stir in England. I am actually dying to read the one about parenthood because it makes it sound like she was just really talking about all of the difficulties of raising children, which is one of my favorite topics. But it got this huge kind of reprimand in England because, in fact, people thought she was going to bring down maternity as an institution, which is very interesting because it is really giving her a lot of power. But she wrote one about being a parent. She wrote one about divorce. And I don't know what the other one was about. But those were much more revealing, much more detailed books. And you got the sense from the interview, but you can also just imagine this, that if she got a very strong reaction from like the entire country of England about having revealed herself, that she might be interested in writing a trilogy, another 3 books, where the narrator is really, really not apparent in any real ways. So A Life's Work, which was about parenting, came out in 2001. Aftermath came out in 2012. Then she published Outline in 2014, Transit in 2016, and Kudos in 2018. So I was so interested in the covers of these books, partially because as a trilogy, you get this kind of sense of continuity. And honestly, I really loved the cover of this just aesthetically. And I also, after having read the book, really loved the idea that there is a lot you could dig into here. But I think that this is another element that Rachel Cusk means to be a little orthogonal, to not be explaining anything about the narrator or too much about the book itself. So in my copy here, we have a seashell, and it looks very much like an ear, which I think is so interesting because this entire book is our narrator listening to stories. She also has mentioned that the book in many ways is indebted to the Odyssey, and that you have this kind of form where you have a narrator who is going along and listening to all of these different people's stories. But I also think it's really interesting that it's not pointing to anything about the identity of our narrator. Okay, we're going to open the book. And we're going to get to this page right at the beginning that says national bestseller, and then there are a bunch of blurbs. And then there's this little paragraph that's like actually on the cover of the book. This is all printed on the opposite side of the cover. And it says, "Outline is a novel in 10 conversations." And I read that and I was like, what? Like, why did they tell me that right then? So it's a very interesting thing to try to avoid the synopsis that they put on any sort of jacket copy. And from my brief foray into writing, I can tell you that, in fact, you may, as a writer, have something to do with the jacket copy, but not a lot. So I always take these with a grain of salt. And a lot of times I will avoid them. I will not read them until after I have read the novel, partially because I just don't want any of the surprises of the novel to be stolen from me. But I also don't want to have like the wrong idea. I mean, to say that Outline is a novel in 10 conversations is probably correct. But I had this idea, like the first thing that popped into my head is we're going to have maybe 2 different people in 10 different conversations, or we're going to have one person having a conversation with 10 people, which is like very simple of me. But I really did resent this kind of condensation of a novel that is so intricate and so complex that they were kind of squashing it down into this one little sentence that I couldn't even avoid reading because, in fact, I didn't know it was real jacket copy. It looks kind of like another blurb. So maybe though we can feel good about moving beyond that idea, that tiny little sentence. Okay, and then we have all the boilerplate stuff. And then we go right into Outline. It's noteworthy that there is no dedication because one of the ways that Cusk is pushing against the idea of identity is she's pushing against the idea that we are made up of our relationships with other people. So in many ways, we know that the narrator of this book has children, but we don't know very much about the children. At one point, her son calls and he says he's lost, and they have this very kind of perfunctory conversation. Although, again, very significant that he thinks he's lost and he's calling his mother, who is in Greece, in order to find himself. Very, very symbolic and very significant. But she is not a woman who is defined by her relationships. When, in fact, the people who she's talking to throughout the novel, they really are talking in many instances, first and foremost, about their relationships. So just this very subtle thing of not having the dedication is subverting this idea that most people define themselves in terms of relationships with other people, and that we should think about that as a concept. Okay, so then we come to the title. I really like the title Outline. I like the idea of it as both that kind of a schema that we have, a very orderly outline, because in many ways this book does have a lot of order. I did this whole thing in the back about all the kind of weaving that we see in the book. It's so interesting. There are a bunch of instances that happen to different people in sort of different settings and with slight variations, but we see those events happening again and again. We also see certain things popping up again. So you have this kind of weaving and these kind of echoes that keep coming up throughout the book. It's interesting to see what she's putting emphasis on. It's interesting to see the way that these different people value these things. And even the idea of separating the novel into discrete instances with different people, it does feel very much in some ways like an outline. However, the other meaning, or one other meaning of the word outline, was in fact more important to me. And this is that idea of drawing an outline. Those of you not on the YouTube, I'm like making a little squiggly thing in the shape of like a person. Like imagine that thing when someone dies on the ground and they make that white line. The idea of the outline of someone is really significant. And in fact, the word outline comes up in a couple of places, and we're going to take a look at them. One is on page 240. So obviously page 240 is toward the end of the novel, and I'm laughing at the idea that I was worried about spoilers because I just don't really think you can spoil this novel. So here we are at the end of the book. She's having a conversation with the woman who is essentially taking her place. She has been teaching at a writing workshop thing in Greece, and she is about to leave, and she's being replaced by someone in many ways who is very much like her in terms of autobiographical data. This is a woman, she's from England, but we don't know how she differs because we in fact don't have a lot of physical details about our narrator. But we do find in this very satisfying way toward the end of the novel that the new person who is coming to replace our narrator had an experience on an airplane, which was very much like the experience that our narrator has at the beginning of the book. So here on page 239, this is the other woman sitting with her seatmate on the airplane, and she's reporting this to our narrator. The longer she listened to his answers, the more she felt that something fundamental was being delineated, something not about him, but about her. He was describing, she realized, a distinction that seemed to grow clearer and clearer the more he talked, a distinction he stood on one side of, while she, it became increasingly apparent, stood on the other. He was describing, in other words, what she herself was not. In everything he said about himself, she found in her own nature a corresponding negative. This anti-description, for want of a better way of putting it, had made something clear to her by a reverse kind of exposition. While he talked, she began to see herself as a shape, an outline, with all the detail filled in around it while the shape itself remained blank. Yet this shape, even while its content remained unknown, gave her for the first time since the incident a sense of who she now was. So this is so fascinating. I mean, you can see how very clearly at the end of the novel, she's kind of handing us a description of what it is she has been up to. But I also really loved this articulation because it's speaking to this very human phenomenon where, of course, when someone is telling a story to someone else, they are choosing a certain story to tell. They are choosing a way to tell it. They're choosing the details. And in fact, often they are exaggerating things, or they are just like making stuff up. And of course, the person who is listening is having all sorts of thoughts about how that person is like what the person is saying or is not like what the person is saying. And then we can take it one step further here with the fact that Rachel Cusk has obviously chosen and curated very carefully and has delineated, see, I'm using the same word that she used, but has very carefully structured them and set them in order to give us a sense of the outline of the narrator. Obviously, this woman could have chosen any of the things that happened to her while she was in Greece and any of the conversations that she had but she in fact is choosing these so they are significant in ways that should allow the reader to begin to see an outline of our narrator. You will notice I have been saying our narrator throughout, and that also is very intentional. So for the vast majority of the book, we don't in fact know her name. And I think lots of readers may have skipped right over the part where we heard her name. So we're going to take a quick look at that now. So when we do in fact learn the name of our narrator, it's relatively late in the book. But what happens on page 211 when we learn her name is an echo of something that happens much earlier. So earlier she mentions that she is trying to get a hold of a mortgage broker because in fact she needs a loan. And then on page 211, we have this scene where she's actually teaching the students in her class, who are yet more people who are telling her stories, and she interrupts the class, in fact, because this important call from the mortgage broker comes in. And simply the fact that she's interrupting the class tells you that it is important to her that she get this loan. My telephone rang on the table in front of me. I saw the number of Lydia at the mortgage company flashing on the screen, and I told the group that we would take a short break. I went out and stood in the corridor among the notice boards. My heart was beating uncomfortably in my chest. Is that Faye? Lydia said. Yes, I said. So this is just the kind of detail that we get about her. It's very subtle. We know that she's waiting for some sort of a home loan, and we know that this is high stakes for her. And honestly, this book felt very tense to me. And I was really surprised when I went back to analyze it that a lot of the tension came from the autobiographical details, not in fact from these stories that other people were telling. I liked those other stories, which is actually good because I think that the idea of this could be sort of tiresome unless these stories were really interesting and well told. But the pieces that we see of the narrator are when I really felt the tension mounting. We're going to now look at the beginning of the novel. We're going to read the first paragraph in a bit, and then we're going to look at some of these autobiographical chunks that come up and provide all of this tension. And, I keep saying autobiographical, and when I'm saying that, I feel like it's Faye. I feel like it is the autobiography of our narrator that we are most interested in, but it also in many ways, of course, is acknowledged that this is a relatively autobiographical book that has a lot to do with Rachel Cusk. So Faye and Rachel, in fact, share a lot of the same biographical elements. But the simple fact that she has a different name, that she's not called Rachel in this book, separates this from like a lot of the autofiction that we see in France, where you're writing novelistic memoirs. Also, the fact that we don't learn the name of the narrator until so late in the novel is also inviting this kind of conflation that happens when we read a novel that feels autobiographical, that's in the first person, and that shares a lot of the details. It's interesting to me, people tend to do this more with women's novels, where if there are elements that are shared between the narrator and the author, they'll automatically sort of conflate them in a way that they don't tend to as much with men. Okay, so we're going to dive into page 3 here, at the beginning of the novel. Before the flight, I was invited for lunch at a London club with a billionaire I'd promised had liberal credentials. He talked in his open necked shirt about new software he was developing that could help organizations identify the employees most likely to rob and betray them in the future. We were meant to be discussing a literary magazine he was thinking of starting up. Unfortunately, I had to leave before we arrived at that subject. He insisted on paying for a taxi to the airport, which was useful since I was late and had a heavy suitcase. This is so interesting. So, a lot of what we are seeing right here is this kind of contrast between the person who she's talking to and our narrator. So, in some ways, just the way that she is describing him, if she's saying he's a billionaire and then he's saying that he's, helping people figure out who's going to rob and betray them, you have this sense of a certain amount of judgment. If it were a peer of the billionaire, that person would probably not describe the billionaire as a billionaire. So you have all of these very subtle ways that we are gathering things about the narrator simply because of the stance that that narrator is taking with the billionaire. We also have the sense that this is someone who is literary because they're talking about the literary magazine. And we get the sense right from the start that this is someone who is composing, this narrator is composing the story using I. It is a first person narration, which is very intimate in some ways. Whenever you have an I narrator, there's always an assumed you. So the reader is always you. It's a really cool thing that literature does. If you have a third person omniscience, it's much further away in some ways. As soon as you have I and is assuming a you have this intimacy of a conversation that's sort of one-on-one. So in some ways we have the intimacy here, but we're only seeing our narrator in contrast to the things that she is noticing. And then, very significantly, the beginning of the next paragraph, which is the second paragraph of the book, we see the word outline. The billionaire had been keen to give me the outline of his life story, which had begun unprepossessingly and ended, obviously, with him being the relaxed, well-heeled man who sat across the table from me today. This is so interesting. This is a perfect example of when paying a lot of attention to the opening of a book will really pay off. So what we have here is this idea that he's trying to tell her the outline of his life. So there we have another idea of a schema, this outline that sort of informs all of the stories that are being told, but also the idea of the outline of the person as becoming clear. So, right from the beginning, we have the sense of people wanting to share an outline of their lives, which does in fact leave us this kind of blank where we come to the narrator herself. I want to look very briefly at something on the next page about the billionaire. And the reason we're going to look at this is to show the ways that Rachel Cusk is choosing the most telling details. So, these are things that people are putting forth in order to build their sense of identity for the person they're speaking with. So they're things that the people are obviously proud of or concerned about. And the choice of these details is so important, both by Rachel Cusk, who is putting them into Faye's story, the story that Faye is reporting, but also the details that she is including of the people who are speaking. So on page 4, we have this. On Sundays, he played drums in a rock band, just for fun. He was expecting his 11th child, which wasn't as bad as it sounded when you considered that he and his wife had once adopted quadruplets from Guatemala. This is so interesting to me because in some ways we think of Elon Musk and all of his many children. And I literally found myself being like, wait, I don't think Elon Musk has adopted quadruplets from Guatemala. But this is that kind of blending of the real world and the world of the story that I think she's really encouraging. It's also, of course, so interesting and so laughable and satirical in lots of ways to think that the billionaire wants to be known for playing the drums on Sundays for fun and then also for having all of these children. So this was so interesting for me. In the back of my book, I always make little page number notes of significant things that I want to share with you. And in this case, I had noted all of the times when we hear about the autobiography of our narrator. And it was so interesting to look at these instances all quick together in kind of a more traditional view of who this person is. So on page 11, This is when she's in the airplane having the conversation with her neighbor. She calls him the neighbor throughout, who is a 66-year-old Greek man, and she sees him quite a bit on the island when they arrive. He began to ask me questions as though he had learned to remind himself to do so, and I wondered what or who had taught him that lesson, which many people never learn. So already that's very interesting because a lot of the people in this book have not learned this. There are very, very few people asking her questions. In fact, the entire book, not the entire book, but most of it is made up of the other people's stories and then small interjections by her. So we'll continue. I said that I lived in London, having very recently moved from the house in the countryside where I had lived alone with my children for the past 3 years, and where, for the 7 years before that, we had lived together with their father. It had been, in other words, our family home, and I had stayed to watch it become the grave of something I could no longer definitively call either a reality or an illusion. I mean, this is so interesting. So, just very briefly, we get this whole outline of the past time of her life, and she is defining herself by her home, where she is living, the number of years, the fact that she has children, and the fact that those children have a father. And in fact, the father is absent. And when she says she had stayed to watch it become the grave of something I could no longer definitively call either a reality or an illusion, we do get the sense that she is talking about her marriage and that her marriage was sort of dying. It was going to the grave, which readers had heard about Rachel Cusk's divorce in the memoir, and that she would go on and live 3 more years in that house and then move to London. So, very importantly, this idea of reality and illusion. Throughout the entire book, there are so many illusions. And that is another one of these. There's so many different strands that you can pull out of this book, not only the question of identity, which is itself an illusion, but all of these other illusions that are really underscoring how important identity and illusion, in fact, are. Okay, so then we move on to page 18. I told him I was a writer, and I was going to Athens for a couple of days to teach a course at a summer school there. The course was entitled How to Write. So we can really glean a lot here too. She's a writer, she's going to Athens. If she's teaching this very basic course, how to write, you do get a sense maybe that she is someone who needs the money. Then we're going to page 42, and we have this autobiographical incursion. He asked whether I was at all familiar with the country, and I said that I had come here to Athens on a somewhat fateful holiday with my children 3 years earlier. So we're also beginning, because we are reading these things in quick succession, to realize that perhaps she had gone there and really decided that was the end of her marriage. Maybe her husband had left her, maybe she was leaving him, but something definitive happened then. Again, it's very shadowy. We're only getting the outline of it, but you do have the sense of her having experienced something that was really consequential during that trip to Athens 3 years before. On page 68, we actually have that quick reference to the mortgage. I took out my phone and dialed the number of the mortgage company in England, who were processing an application I had made just before I left for Athens to increase my loan. So again, here we have a sense that this is maybe a woman who's having some money problems. And on page 94, we have something that's very interesting. Rachel Cusk, she grew up Catholic. And if you know that, in fact, you would know that if you are a reader of hers, you would know that from her memoirs potentially. I didn't actually know that until I heard it in an interview. And honestly, I feel like I should reread this whole book just with that, because in fact, there are different mentions of priests and different mentions of anointing things. Again, this is another thread that we could pull from this incredible tapestry. On page 94, we have this sentiment on the part of our neighbor that does in fact feel very Catholic. Sometimes it has seemed to me that life is a series of punishments for such moments of unawareness, that one forges one's own destiny, that what you don't know and don't make the effort to understand will become the very thing you are forced into knowledge of. While I spoke, Paniotis looked more and more aghast. That is a terrible notion that only a Catholic would have come up with, he said. So again, we have this other, in fact, very important element of her identity. I mean, religion isn't necessarily an important identity, but here it is shaping who she is, someone who is thinking about destiny and thinking about what is deserved and the idea of punishment. She is still obviously very, very shadowy, but she's coming a bit more into focus. And on page 171, we're going to look at the last little snippet of these autobiographical data. This is the neighbor, the 66-year-old Greek man. Has there really been no one, he asked. There had, I said, been someone. We were still very good friends, but I hadn't wanted to carry on with it. I was trying to find a different way of living in the world. This is so interesting to me. In many ways, this is such an interesting description of the point of the book, that she's trying to find this different way that isn't about identifying yourself through relationships. In fact, it's about identifying yourself in ways that are really unusual. In fact, they're ways that I can't quite figure out. So we're going to move on now to the chunk of the podcast where I'm going to give you a little snippet of what I learned from this incredible interview. And then we're going to look at an example of this notion in the novel itself. So this is all coming from a podcast called Lit House. It is out of Norway. I'm not sure how often their talks are in English, but this was very interesting. And I will say that part of what was so interesting about listening to this interview was that I had all of these ideas of identity and illusion in my head. So, of course, it was perfect that I couldn't see these people. They were these disembodied voices that I was listening to. And it was even better that one of them, I think she's a Norwegian speaker, was speaking English in a way that was totally understandable, but I think in many ways was less nuanced than some English speakers might be. So it was very kind of straightforward and blunt in ways that I think Rachel Cusk is thinking would be very good. This idea of being able to sort of strip language down and to pull identity out of it. So again, you have this idea of a little bit of alienation and of thinking about our assumptions about identity. It was also so interesting to me because I felt like there was a little tension between the two of them. And I think that's probably just because of the bold nature of the interviewer. But it was very interesting for me to get a sense of this kind of tension. And in some places, even to feel like Rachel Cusk was also feeling this kind of tension and this boldness. And you got the sense that this was kind of yet another one of these conversations, very much like all the conversations that we hear in this book. So check it out. It was so interesting. Okay, so we're going to move on to the first idea that really captured me. And this is an idea of prior knowledge. So right at the top of the interview, Rachel Cusk says that she was trying to write a book with no prior knowledge. And our trusty interviewer asked her what she meant by that. And it was such an interesting idea, which is simply that literature is many times based on this idea of pretending that you have forgotten something. So if you're reading a book and it's set in New York, you kind of have to allow yourself to see a vision that is painted by the writer. The idea of prior knowledge also has everything to do with the assumptions that we make. So when we looked at the billionaire at the beginning of this novel, there is all of these assumptions that we make because we have prior knowledge about billionaires. The important thing about this idea of prior knowledge is that Rachel Cusk thinks that the idea of the omniscient narrator and the idea of really speaking from a place of authority was most used when the novel was sort of trying to say something about morality, something that is good or something that is bad, something that is deeply judgy, simply by dint of the language that it's using and the details that it's choosing and the narrative stance, and that really leaning on people's prior knowledge or sort of pushing against their prior knowledge by giving them details that don't square with their idea of something is a way of really pushing a certain agenda. So what she's trying to get at here in a book like Outline and like Transit and Kudos is a vision of the world and also the experience of women. She talks specifically about that. One that is less judgy and one that relies on fewer assumptions. And one of the ways that she does this the best in the book, this idea of sort of not leaning on prior knowledge, is some of her descriptions. Right at the beginning on page 12, when she is describing her neighbor in the airplane, the guy sitting next to her, the description's actually pretty grotesque. And in lots of cases, when she's describing these men, when she's describing Ryan, the descriptions are so strange. Grotesque was the word that kept coming up for me. And it was so purposefully done and so obvious in a book that is not otherwise describing people very carefully. The women are described by their clothing, but not often by their physical features. You got the sense that she's really making a point here. And I would argue, in fact, that the point she's making is that when I say to you, I've said it several times, when I say a 66-year-old Greek man who used to be really wealthy and is now not quite so wealthy, you have a vision in your head. And the vision that she supplies for us is actually a little at odds with what I had in my mind. In many ways, it has to be at odds with everyone's because, in fact, it is so specific. Here is the description. It was difficult to study my neighbor's face from the adjacent seat, but in the light-inflected darkness it had become a landscape of peaks and crevices, from the center of which rose the extraordinary hook of his nose, casting deep ravines of shadow on either side so that I could barely see his eyes. His lips were thin and his mouth wide and slightly gaping. The part between his nose and upper lip was long and fleshy, and he touched it frequently, so that even when he smiled, his teeth remained hidden. I mean, it's actually really creepy in some ways. And then this point is taken even further on page 58 when we have this. My neighbor from the plain was a good foot shorter than me and twice as wide. Since I had got to know him sitting down, it was difficult to integrate these dimensions with his character. So that is so interesting too. She's really getting at the idea that we make assumptions even about people who are sitting right next to us. She is also making assumptions here that people care about height and weight, which is the perfect segue into the next idea. So she talks a lot about how writing women into literature, writing about any woman, is almost pornographic. That's the word that she uses. And of course, the interviewer was like, "What do you mean by that?" And she very clearly articulated that there is this sense of women as being described very carefully and being described by their physical features in literature in a way that is not devoid of judgment. She talks about being someone who's not very comfortable writing, writing the body and writing about sex and writing about physical description. And what I would argue is that is because women are so judged physically in so many different ways, both conscious and unconscious, and all these terrible biases, that what she's doing here with the description of the men, these very detailed and often grotesque descriptions of these men, is making a point that men are often described, I think, probably in more generic terms, where the physicality of women, and here I'm going out on a bit of a limb. I'm going to have to get back in the library and do some research and see if this is correct. But my sense is that men are not described as granularly as women. And then here we have the opposite of that. And in fact, the grotesqueness of it is a little payback for all those times when women have been described physically in a very voyeuristic and a very judgy kind of way. And she actually, very helpfully, in terms of proving my thesis, gives us this example of Ryan reacting to the physicality of a woman. And she doesn't describe the woman, our narrator does not, but is simply showing us how visceral Ryan's reaction is to this woman. On page 179, we have this. My friend Elena was very beautiful. Ryan was beside himself. He'd been ambling along the street and spied us sitting at a bar. She's in a different league, he said, when she excused herself to go and make a phone call. Elena was 36, intelligent, exquisitely dressed. She's another proposition entirely, he said. So this is so interesting. I mean, here he's using different metaphors. She's in a different league, which is this kind of competitive sports thing. And then this idea of her as being another proposition. I mean, the word proposition for me really brings up the idea of like a man propositioning a woman, this idea of like sexual advancement. So we have this very clear selection of details too on the part of our narrator. This woman is 36, she's intelligent and exquisitely dressed. So these are things, some of them that you would be able to tell from the outside and some that you would not. And they are judgments in the sense that these are things that are important to the narrator. So this description, both Ryan's reaction and the description on the part of the narrator, really get to this idea. She mentions in the interview that she wanted to write a story that removes the physical body of the narrator and even most other bodies. She also says she wants to write about womanhood without inviting judgment. So you have this idea of being very careful about the details that she is choosing and the way that she is describing women. So another point that was made during the interview that I really loved, and it was something that I had noted in the back and made lots of page numbers referring back to it, is this idea of all of the spaces in this book. So this is a book about a woman whose identity is not obvious to us, and perhaps is not fully obvious to her. And we are seeing her largely in these liminal spaces. So liminal spaces in literature might be a hallway or it might be a doorway, things where you would sort of pass through and have some sort of evolution. You might see some sort of change or some sort of growth or even some sort of recognition or some sort of knowledge being gained. And here we have this woman in nothing but liminal spaces. So she's in the airplane to begin with. It's something that is moving. So you have this idea of evolution. She's going to a new place. Things are novel and, in fact, very interesting, and in fact, some ways very threatening in the airplane where she's thinking so much about mortality. Then we have her in a space that is a rented space. And that space is so interesting because we do get a very carefully curated and very kind of interesting, but still shadowy idea of the person whose home this is, whose apartment this is. At the beginning, there's that statue that is talking about the illusion of a woman. And there's a description of that ship that is on her wall and of some of the books. So you have this sense of these few items as being really indicative of what this person is about. Of course, that does leave her very shadowy. And a lot of the spaces are like that. She's, on the boat, or she's out in bars. She's in places that are not, in fact, domestic. And she made the most interesting point in the interview, which is that these spaces are important because they are not reflecting any sort of identity. So you can imagine if we were going to see Faye in her house, which we do, in fact, in transit, although it's a house that is also in transit and is in chaos. But if we're going to see her in her own home, even if it were very spare, that would tell us something about her. But the furnishings and all of the things that she would have in her home, and simply the kind of home itself, all of that would tell us a lot about her identity. So this is a narrator who is in spaces where the reader can't really get any sort of identity. And I loved the idea of these spaces as not reflecting identity, because that is, in fact, why liminal spaces work. I mean, this is like this very old idea about how to look at literature. And in some ways, it feels like an algebraic equation that you learn and you apply without kind of knowing why it works. And it was so cool to understand that in many ways, this idea works, this concept of these liminal spaces, because in fact, it puts characters into spaces where they are not surrounded by their identity. And so that would either in some ways consolidate the identity they think they have, or it would change their identity. So it was so cool because essentially Rachel Cusk was breaking down this idea of liminal spaces and why they can be occasions for so much growth and why they can be places where you have this kind of evolution. So the last notion that I want to talk about that came from the interview was this idea of how in her literature, one of the things she's exploring again and again is this idea of what life looks like if you are not defined by relationships and by place. The way she says it is that you are not choosing to cleave to those relationships or those places, which is so beautifully stated. But it is such an interesting idea because I think most of us in many ways define ourselves through our relationships and our spaces. It's a very interesting idea, first of all, to write about other ways that people identify themselves, but also to have like thousands and thousands of readers reading along and being forced in some ways to think about identity because of the ways that Cusk is. And on page 105, we have this interesting comment about marriage that really speaks to this notion. So importantly, this is not, in fact, Faye who is speaking. This seems like it would be way too much revelation on the part of Faye. This is another person who is telling her story, and a lot of this woman's story has to do with marriage. On 105, it says this. I replied that I wasn't sure it was possible in marriage to know what you actually were, or indeed to separate what you were from what you had become through the other person. I thought the whole idea of a real self might be illusory. And she has real there in quotation marks. So this is very much like that point that she makes at the beginning about not being sure about something being a real thing or being an illusion. And again, here she is speaking to marriage and to the identity that you derive through your marriage. It's very interesting to note, this is such a small thing, but it's so impactful. When she's quoting other people and their stories, there are quotation marks, but when she answers, she says things like, I replied that I wasn't sure, but there are no quotation marks. And it's so important because it really does tie her into the narrative. It sort of makes her part of the wallpaper, but it also makes her kind of more shadowy because in fact, we're not hearing her voice, we're hearing a report of her voice. And in this case, it's very important because she's articulating one of these main ideas, which is that when you are in a relationship, it is very difficult to understand who you are without those relationships. We're now going to look at the close of the novel. And it's so interesting. At the very end, when we have this woman arriving who is essentially going to substitute for Faye, all of the differences between them are so interesting. And the similarities between them are such that for a minute, when I began this last section, I had this thought that wait, is this actually her? Is she somehow kind of meeting herself in her apartment? which was a little bit outlandish and in fact not what Rachel Cusk has in mind. And the way that she notifies you of the fact that this other woman is real and is not some sort of avatar of Faye is that there are very specific details about the woman and about how she is dressed. And she says she's just arrived from Birmingham. I think it's Birmingham. So anyway, we have some concrete details very quickly that tell us, in fact, that this is a woman who is very similar to Faye, but someone who is their own person and is replacing her. The story that the woman has to tell, the one that she launches into, as do all of these other people with our narrator, has to do with being mugged. And this experience of being mugged was very traumatic for her. And for a long time, it was all she could talk about until she decided that she needed to just boil it down to the word drama. And that would, in fact, help her. This actually gets to an idea that Cusk mentions in the interview, which is this idea of the sort of healing that can happen in telling stories, and that is sort of the basis of psychotherapy. And that in many ways, a lot of the people in this book, she doesn't quite say this, but you get the sense that she is indicating that the reason the people are talking is in order to move through something and process something and sort of exercise something. So on page 245, we have this description of this woman who is taking Faye's place. And she also has had this experience that is worth talking about when she was on the airplane. And it is, in fact, very much like the experience that Faye had with her person on the airplane. So again, we have these echoes, we have these beautiful, not only do we have this beautiful weaving throughout, but there are lots of bookends. You have things introduced at the very beginning and we see them again at the very end. And, like a quarter in, you'll see something that is reflected back 3/4 of the way through. It's incredibly well structured. So on 245, we have the woman recounting her story of her neighbor on her airplane flight. It was almost a battle of wills, his discipline against my emotion, with only the armrest between us. I waited for him to ask me a question, which after all would have been only polite, but he didn't, even though I had asked him so many questions about himself. He sealed himself in his own view of life, even at the risk of causing offense, because he knew that view to be under threat. She had sat there, she said, and thought about her own lifelong habit of explaining herself, and she thought about this power of silence, which put people out of each other's reach. Lately, since the incident, she's referring to the mugging, now that things had gotten harder to explain and the explanations were harsher and bleaker, even her closest friends had started to tell her to stop talking about it, as though by talking about it, she made it continue to exist. Yet if people were silent about the things that had happened to them, was something not being betrayed, even if only the version of themselves that had experienced them? So this is such a key moment at the very end of the book where we're really digging into this idea of what does it mean to say these things and how much, in fact, do they create our identities and how important is it to have all of these different selves and to be able to articulate them and to be able to show other people who you are by dint of whatever story it is you're telling. And then I thought it was so amazing because on the very next page, we do in fact have the woman telling the story, although at this point she has really boiled it down. And we have this on 246. I asked her whether she would mind telling me about the incident, and her face took on a look of alarm. She put her hands to her throat where 2 blue veins stood out. Bloke jumped out of a bush, she squawked, tried to strangle me. So what was so incredible to me here, and so actually kind of funny in some ways, is this idea of bloke jumped out of a bush, tried to strangle me, and the idea that she is squawking. What Cusk is doing here is telling us so much about this woman, a little bit about the incident, of course, but the idea of bloke and the idea that she has lost both of the subjects. Grammatically, she's cutting off the subject in those sentences. Both of them are fragments. The fact that this woman is squawking, all of these things are great examples of Cusk showing us how much we assume when we hear people speak a certain way. And in fact, you don't even have to hear her. You just see it written on the page. So there's this way that it's so heavily coded, and I'm not savvy enough to know exactly what is being transmitted with the word bloke, but I imagine there's a class judgment there. It's just a fascinating way to on page 245, give us this kind of theoretical version of something, and then on the very next page on 246, to give us an example of that kind of articulating of an event and how it does, in fact, inform the vision that other people have of us. Unbelievable. We're going to close by looking at the last few pages of the book. This is a conversation, this is still the same conversation between Faye and the woman who is replacing her. She asked whether there was anything I felt she particularly ought to see while she was here. She knew the place was packed with sites of global cultural importance, but for some reason she found that idea a bit overwhelming. If there was something smaller, something I personally valued, she would be glad to know about it. So even here in a paragraph that is ostensibly about sightseeing, we're having this idea that so many details and such a vast space don't really tell us very much about a place or about a person, when in fact what's much more important is maybe a single detail or a single space that is more intimate. So then we have the response on the part of Faye. I said she should go to the agora and look at the headless statues of goddesses in the colonnade. It was cool there and peaceful, and the massive marble bodies in their soft-looking draperies, so anonymous and mute, were strangely consoling. I once spent 3 weeks here alone with my children, I said, when we were stuck because all the flights out had been canceled. Though you couldn't see it, it was said that there was a great cloud of ash in the sky. This is so fascinating. So first of all, these headless statues, I mean, in many ways, we have this narrator, Faye. We don't know what she looks like. In some ways, she is kind of headless. And in some ways, she's kind of this classic person. I mentioned earlier that Rachel Cusk sees this very much as an Odyssey, where we have Odysseus, floating around the Aegean Sea here in Greece. So you have this idea of these people as being mute and also being very comforting, and that their robes are very soft, even though they're made of marble, one assumes. So you have all of these different statues in this agora, this kind of marketplace, are reflecting exactly what our narrator is doing. Then we have this very interesting thing that she was here with her children. So we're hearkening back for the third time to that 3-year mark, because we know that 3 years ago her life changed in some way and she came. And the other thing that was so interesting, that idea of the cloud of ash is a real life event. Of course, that was when that volcano in Iceland erupted in 2011. Which is so interesting too, because this book came out in 2014. So it would have been 3 years before that they would have been talking about this volcano in Iceland, when we would have had whatever the incident was in this narrator's life. But this idea of including things that are real, I mean, obviously Athens is real and airplanes are real, but this idea of placing it in time also adds a certain verisimilitude and sort of grounds us in time and in place in a way that the reader is kind of craving at this point. And because she gives us these details, you realize how many of them, in fact, are absent. And then, of course, the idea of this great cloud in the sky that you can't see it. It's this idea of identity, the same thing. There are all of these sort of particles that make up someone's identity. But in fact, that sort of cloud of details, that cloud of particles, is in fact not a coherent, solid sort of identity. And then Cusk takes it a little bit further, further down on 247. So we stayed here for 3 weeks. And because we weren't meant to be here, I felt that we became, in a sense, invisible. We didn't see anyone or speak to anyone except each other in all that time, though I had friends in Athens I could have called, but I didn't call them. The feeling of invisibility was too powerful. So interesting also, because this would have been a time of a lot of upheaval in her life. She's with her children, so in some senses she is cleaving to that identity and that relationship, but she is also mourning the loss of her relationship with her husband. And it's so fascinating that her children are sort of part of her identity, but beyond that, she feels invisible. They are sort of acting as a unit, but she still feels that the three of them they're not being seen, in some ways because they are not having the sorts of conversations that might in fact make them feel more real because of the way they could present themselves to people. So then a little further down, the woman who is replacing Faye asks Faye if she would like to go to the agora with her. And in order for this last little chunk, the final part of the book, the last couple of paragraphs, to make sense, I need to read something from page 8. So on page 8, we have a very important moment. This is another one of these things where there are these cool bookends, where you have something in the beginning that is echoed at the very end and sort of the same distance from the end. It's a very cool structure. So this is when she is talking to the neighbor, the Greek man on the airplane. We had lived until now on the small island where both of them were born, an island you would certainly not have heard of despite its prolixity to some well-known tourist destinations. Proximity, I said. I think you mean proximity. I do beg your pardon, he said. I mean, of course, proximity. So this is so important. First of all, this gentleman is describing himself and his family and where they live, and the fact that they are very defined by the island that they live on, in much the same way that she and her children are in Athens at the end, and it is not defining them. And it's so significant here that he says the prolixity. So prolixity is just the idea of like using way too many words. It's like a bad thing where you're just, talking and talking and talking, which is so significant because, of course, these people, we're seeing so many examples of prolixity all throughout the book where our narrator is saying almost nothing. So you have this idea of prolixity as being something that is kind of lobbed out in this very strange and kind of nonsensical way in the very beginning of the book. And in some ways, you could even extrapolate this idea that prolixity, because it is in this sentence in sort of the wrong way, its identity, in fact, is sort of disrupted. And as the reader, you're like, wait, prolixity doesn't mean proximity. So you have this sense of an alienation in language, but also in context and identity right at the beginning of the book. It's also significant, of course, that he means proximity, because of this idea of cleaving to relationships and places and proximity as being so important. So simply that idea of being able to define yourself by being close to something. So then at the very end of the book, we have this. My phone rang and the cheerful, undaunted tones of my neighbor came pealing down the line. He hoped I found myself well this morning, he said. He trusted there had been no further incidents to upset me. I had not, he noticed, responded to his texts, so he thought he would call me directly. He had been thinking of me. He was wondering whether I had time for an excursion out to sea before my flight. I said I was not. I hoped we would meet again the next time he found himself in London, but for now I had an engagement with someone to do some sightseeing. In that case, he said, I will spend the day in solicitude. You mean solitude, I said. I do beg your pardon, he said. Of course, I mean solitude. Oh my God, what an incredible ending. So the idea of ending with this word solitude is so important. We started with this idea that it would really behoove you to look at the beginning, the opening paragraphs of a difficult text. And it also is incredibly important to really spend some time with that last word. And in some ways, you're forced to, because whatever word comes last is sort of the one that is lingering in your mind. And it is so important here that it is solitude. It's also so important that solicitude is the word that he's saying first. So, of course, solicitude is it's like caring for someone, which is so sweet because in many ways what he is doing, I mean, he's also kind of lecherous and gross. And when he tried to kiss her, it was so yucky. But you do get this sense that he is trying to make a nice gesture. But you also, within solicitude, have this idea of solicit, this idea of, soliciting sex. So just like prolixity, we have this word that is kind of taken out of context. And because it is taken out of context, this word of solicitude, which can both mean caring and also, coming on to someone, then has this incredible slippage and ends up at the word solitude. That seems like a very good place to stop. I loved this book so much, and I really love talking about it today with you all. It was such a great opportunity to really dig in to the incredible stuff that Rachel Cusk is doing here. I will most definitely be going on to read the other two books in the trilogy. I'm super interested in what Faye is either going to do or not do. And I'm also really interested in going back and looking at those autobiographies just to see the way that Rachel Cusk is operating when she in fact is putting her identity really out there in the world. So thank you all very much for tuning in. Happy reading.